Rudeus Greyrat and Subaru Natsuki get bad reputations on the internet. So much so that I sometimes wonder if people even watched or read the same thing I did. I also wonder why it's considered unusual to be a fan of both of them at the same time, in spite of both being peak Isekai. It's funny to me that these two fandoms are so at odds in spite of having so much in common though. Especially since both their authors are such good friends. The stories are very detailed and deal with a lot of depth and nuance, and both get a lot of flack outside of their respective fan bases. And of course, the internet decided that they were going to egregiously misrepresent both characters because they have some glaring flaws. But I mostly blame Twitter for the retardation, because the debate around some of this stuff has been particularly active there since the end of the most recent core of Jobless Reincarnation. It's brought up a lot of the misguided ideas that surround both of these protagonists, and more so Rudy than Subaru. Characterizations that I find to be mindless, banal, and ignorant, so I figured I'd dive into these characters themselves and how they're put together to make some of the most fantastically detailed characters in anime, because I find it unfair that they get so much hate.
俺ようやくわかったよ。自分がまだまだ子供だったって。前世の記憶で大人ぶってただけのガキだって。
I actually do love Rudeus Greyrat as the protagonist of Mushoku Tensei. Flawed as he is, he's a great and very human character who is the epitome of growth across someone's life, who reflects on his actions in his previous life and gets better over time. Every mistake he makes comes with a lesson he carries forward, and his growth and development over the course of the last 2 seasons has been phenomenal. Unfortunately, a lot of people disagree with me, including some of my friends who would write him off as just a degenerate. Rudy gets characterized as nothing but a scumbag and a creep, and to some extent rightfully so because of his actions, but there's so much more to this character than just that, and letting this one aspect of him dictate your perception of him is an injustice. The things he gets the most flack for by people who honestly don't really pay much attention to what they watch or read is the sex that's featured in the show. Now, it's not all actually that graphic. In fact, I don't recall so much as a titty popping out at all, and the closest we ever get is these scenes involving a different character and her sexual appetite rather than Rudy himself. But there are very clear and obvious sexual themes that run throughout the show. And bringing us around to the point, Rudeus is a reincarnated shut-in who spent all his time and money satisfying those fleshly desires. And in the show, he continues some of those trends well into his first 20 years of life. He spends a lot of time as a child doing perverted things and stealing women's underwear and peeping whenever he can, which is stereotypical pervert character shenanigans. But the worst of it is the mischaracterization that he's guilty of some not so nice sex crimes like grooming and PDF stuff. And just to quickly address those, if he were a groomer, and I do realize that there is a section in the book that can be interpreted that way, but was actually a joke, how does that work when he spent years of his life away from Sophie? He was separated from her at like 6 years old, and didn't see her until he was 15 or 16. And Roxy being much older than him, and being away from him for an equal amount of time. He showed no intention of being manipulative or exploitative towards them. The best example you can point to of him being manipulative or exploitative towards them is when he decides to use otome game tactics to butter Roxy up. But even then, you have to have a malevolent interpretation of those actions, and, well, I don't think it fits. And then we get to Eris, who left him after their night together. These characters weren't particularly desperate to be attached to Rudy. Not in any way that shows the true mental breakdown of someone manipulated into a false sense of attachment. To interpret Sophie's actions as her being manipulated or groomed, you have to ignore the fact that Rudy really was her savior from her bullies, and that he was really her only friend. And that's not by any attempt of his to isolate her, it's just the fact that most of the kids in the village didn't want anything to do with her, because she looked like a superb. So then what about the PDF stuff? Well, I have to ask, why didn't he immediately jump on Sophie the moment he realized she was a girl, or attempt any advances upon her before his reunion with her much later in life? To my knowledge, he never once took action against her until she encouraged him to do so when they were adults. When you put these claims under the microscope, they don't hold up. And I could do a whole video in and of itself debunking the claims, so I won't go into full detail here. Suffice it to say, thorough examination of the evidence shows he's innocent of all of these harsher criticisms. But this is all a distraction from the point of the character, and the most important point in this discussion of Rudy as a character is that jobless reincarnation is the story of someone gifted the second chance to live life over again, and to do all the things they never got to. Ultimately, the story of Rudeus Greyrat is the story of growth and second chances. It's the story of a boy coming to terms with his own flaws and being mature enough to finally confront them head on. It gives us a glimpse into the concept of someone with a troubled past, someone who definitively has sins and shortcomings, being shown enough grace by fate as to have a chance to do better in life than be consumed by those things. A kind of story I find I really love. And hell, for almost all of the things he's purported to have done, there were consequences, and he actually had to grapple with his own actions, and those events ultimately led him to realize just how wrong he actually was to do those things. I mean, his attempts at Eris before turning point 2 ended with him getting his lumps from her, and he eventually grows out of giving into his desires whenever they come at him. And in other cases, when he acts out or screws up, he is left to regret what he did and deal with the aftermath. Like what happened when he lashed out at Sarah unjustly. Watching him develop from an immature person chasing down every desire to spring to his mind to someone who understands the world better and is able to keep himself in check, for the most part, is one of the brilliant parts of the series. And it makes me confident saying that Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation is an excellent work of fiction. And now, Rudy is definitely guilty of a lot of things. I could make a decent list of them if not for the sake of time, but all they serve as is a mark by which to compare his character at different points. This story, in as far as I've seen, has been entirely about growing up and making the most of second chances. It is about having the will to move forward and to overcome past mistakes and trauma, and uses an intentionally highly flawed protagonist to show how even the worst kinds of people can change for the better. In spite of its seinen sexual content, Mushoku Tensei is actually a very positive story about learning from your mistakes and not letting them bind you down in self-pity. For example, the first thing Rudy has to confront is his own woe is me mentality and the fear that spawned from it that allowed him to isolate himself. He was bullied in his first life, and the result of that was him spending decades afraid of leaving his room for fear of being mocked by everyone around him. It left him traumatized to the point where he couldn't trust anyone, and so paranoid about people that he was convinced everyone in the world was laughing behind his back. Even after his reincarnation, he still struggles with his fear of people putting him down, and that locks him in place at home for the first few years of his new life until Roxy ultimately takes him out towards the village. In his second life, he's finally able to overcome that and admit that the only thing that held him back was the fact he was too immature to fix it. And this marks the start of his journey towards shedding his old life and becoming a new person. Also, there's his problem-causing sexual habits that he ends up grappling with too in many different situations, which you can see him overcome during the course of his trip home from the Demon Continent. The sexual content in this story isn't without a reason and is always accompanied by some major turning point in Rudy's life. Usually it's healing from some form of trauma that he's been stuck on for quite some time, or him finally moving past one of his own mental blocks. The first one we can look at is shortly after his encounter with the dragon god Orsted, where Eris comes to understand she is now the head of her family, and she feels as though she has nobody left to support her but him. To pivot away from Eris, in Rudy's case, this is the real beginning of his journey towards maturity. After the heartbreak he suffers when Eris abandons him without so much as a word, he feels the need to lock himself away yet again. This time, however, he's grown up enough to decide not to let his sorrows drown him, as he's reminded that there are still things that need his attention. It's his formal acknowledgement that, in spite of whatever pain or hurt he suffered, he still has an obligation to move forward, and that the blame for his seclusion falls solely on him alone if he chooses to give in and wallow in his own pity. In the case of Sylphie, there's more than just curing his physical problem. It's a marker for his healing from all the pain of his abandonment earlier in the series, as well as for how far he's come from the little pest he was as a kid. It's taken time, but he's finally starting to resemble a real man, and at this point, he chooses to marry and settle down with Sylphie. And then his thing with Roxy at the end of the most recent cour of Jobless Reincarnation is the final marker in his journey to maturity, one where he's able to recognize how wrong he was in many of his assumptions. He can now fully admit he was just an immature brat pretending at being grown up because he had memories from his past life. He's able to admit that the way he responded to his parents' death in his first life was abhorrent, and he's finally able to really take on life as an adult. To reiterate, the themes of Rudeus's character are growth and second chances. He likes to think himself more mature than he actually is because he retains memories from his old life. But the fact is that even in that state, he was still an overgrown child who never managed to pull himself out of that self-pity he chose to wallow in. This immaturity manifests in a number of ways, causing him to be in the wrong and have to either make amends or accept the consequences of his actions. Take that scene in Season 2, Part 1, where Rudy lashes out at Sarah in frustration at everything he's suffering from. It costs him his relationship with the girl, and he then chooses to leave town and run away from it. This is an example of him not being able to handle the burden of his own emotions and being far more immature than he likes to think he is. It shows there's still a fundamental flaw with him even after all the growth he's demonstrated. And this is the brilliance of Rudeus Greyrat, the very human nature of his character. It builds him up to be a flawed character and not a bad one, with the flaws being what you watch the character grow out of as time passes, and the things that are intentionally made to be negative, and the things you're not supposed to like. Eventually, he comes to be fully aware of just how immature he really is, and that he was just fooling himself into thinking otherwise because of those memories. There are many poignant moments across the series that point you to what you should and shouldn't admire about this character, and what he truly is. Ultimately, what tends to get lost in the heat of the moment is that Rudy was never meant to be a perfect man. He was meant to embody the shortcomings of a mortal man and how they can be overcome. It's a view of life as it is, a man making mistakes and falling short of his ideal, but never failing to get back up and continue forward and struggle to be greater. That is maturity. It isn't perfection, it is the ability to acknowledge your own imperfections and correct them. And to that end, Rudeus Greyrat is an incredible example of well-structured character growth. So far, he has not yet become perfect. He is not the ideal hero, but he has come remarkably far, and if you can't appreciate the effort he has made to change himself, well, maybe you should be a little bit less judgmental. And that finally brings me around to the other subject of this project.